Welcome to the 7th meeting of the Cambridge Seminar on the Future of the Island of Ireland. The seminar is hosted by Sidney Sussex College and by the Centre for Geopolitics, to which the conveners are particularly grateful for hosting our website and for their continued support. This evening, we are going to be involved in a debate which will be particularly interesting and particularly exciting because of the quality, exceptional quality of our two speakers. But before I say anything more about them, I should introduce our convener and the engineer of the whole session, Barry Colfer, who will continue with introducing the speakers. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, Eugenio. And as always, good evening, everyone in Europe, and good afternoon, friends joining in North America. It's my great pleasure to welcome our speakers tonight. Claire Hanna is an SDLP Member of Parliament for South Belfast, first elected to that role in December 2019. Previous to that, Claire served as a Belfast City Councillor and then as MLA in the Northern Ireland Assembly until her election to Parliament. In the Assembly, Claire has served as Vice President of the Finance Committee, as well as on the Public Accounts Committee and the Environmental Committees. Claire has chaired Assembly all-party groups on international development and arts, and indeed, previous to her life in politics, Claire's professional background was in international development, latterly in a policy and education role. Claire, thank you so much for being with us. Claire's discussant tonight will be Professor Nicholas Allen. Nicholas is the director of the Wilson Centre at the University of Georgia and holds an endowed professorship in the humanities. His latest book, Ireland Literature and the Coast, Sea Tangled, was published in December 2020 by Oxford University Press and is available in most good bookshops. Nicholas has been the Burns Visiting Scholar at Boston College and has previously won many grants and awards, including for the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Irish Research Council. Nicholas is also a great host, and he put me up last time I was in visiting Georgia, the only time I was there. Both of our speakers are proud Belfast people, so I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. The format, as always, is Claire is going to intervene for between 10 and 15 minutes. This will be followed by a discussion with Nicholas, which will bring us to about 25 to the hour, and then we'll finish off the hour going through questions and answers. Once again, thanks so much to our speakers, and I'll hand you over to Claire.
Thank you very much, Barry, and thank you all for the invitation. It's been a really interesting series and a pleasure to participate. And I should briefly just explain the title, Picking Up the Pieces. I was at a Robert Fisk talk once a few years ago called The Current Crisis in the Middle East, and he explained that basically that was an evergreen lecture title that he had spoken under for the last 30 years. So when you asked me for a subtitle, I thought that Picking Up the Pieces was probably as good as any one in Northern Ireland. And I suppose the lure of trying to say something new when you have opportunities like this is kind of outweighed by the reality that as Hume would have it, the problem hasn't changed and neither really have the solutions. And I think the solutions are all around relationships. Personally, and certainly for the party I represent, the Good Friday Agreement is still the political lodestar. And I think it is invoked very frequently, but I don't know quite that people understand, I suppose, it's quasi-philosophical status and just how much a part of the constitutional fabric it is, and that it's not just a kind of a point in time set of rules, but just a genuine framework for all of the core relationships within Northern Ireland, North and South, and East and West of Britain and Ireland operating as neighbours and friends, and that those relationships are necessary for general kind of peace, love and happiness, but also just the reality of managing issues that don't stop at borders and the very many public policy challenges that relate to such a complex people. And it's important, I think, that people don't think about the Good Friday Agreement, as I say, as some sort of relic of 1998 that you put up on the wall and you treat as an ornament, but rather as a toolkit and something that can evolve and get us through the next decades in this kind of complicated place. the ethos of Human Mallon, who are behind it, and one that I share, is that it is going to be relationships that either bring about potentially in time a new Ireland, or that just make the status quo and the reality of where we live now more equal and more harmonious. The Good Friday Agreement wasn't ever about territory or border or flags or the sharp edges of sovereignty. It was about finding ways of working based on mutual trust. And I suppose down to the fact that the Good Friday Agreement preamble reflects the language in the Treaty of Rome. They're coming from the same place intellectually. So I suppose we can't be that surprised that some of those who are either minimalist or unsupportive of the Good Friday Agreement were drawn to Brexit. And I suppose, the Good Friday Agreement and the European Union's approach, quite fluid approach to interdependence and common endeavour, was a political ideology that it was essentially rejected by Brexit. And I suppose it was about softening the lines of things that had driven conflict here around identity and as I say, those sharp notions of sovereignty. And Brexit was always going to create a perception of winners and losers, where the Good Friday Agreement tried to be ambiguous about those things. So yes, it's clunky. Yes, it's a contrivance, the Good Friday Agreement, as any way of governing Northern Ireland would probably be, and it probably shouldn't remain in exactly the current format, because there's a sense in which it's locking in sectarianism in terms of how it's being operated. I know we might pick up with that later, but the basic concepts of partnership and compromise and an architecture to manage power sharing and protect minorities hasn't been bettered as an idea. This period of time in Northern Ireland, I keep hearing the phrase that it's a time between times, and about the closest analogous thing I can find to describe it for people who maybe aren't living here is James Joyce's Dubliners, and that's capturing that city at the turn of the century that was exhausted, that had kind of lost its way, that was economically stagnant, and it was thwarted at I suppose frustrated at the thwarting of home rule. Joyce was showing a lot of skepticism about native or nascent Irish nationalism, but just generally there was a sense of paralysis and I suppose the fate of the city being in the hands and at the mercy of others. And there's a lot of that energy in Northern Ireland at the moment, that decisions about our future and our fate are not being decided in Belfast or by the people of Northern Ireland, but in London or perhaps in Brussels, or that they're being shaped by maybe the politics of independence of Scotland. And I suppose even the sense that what now seems very attractive, the sort of stability and status quo of pre-2016, probably isn't really on the table anymore, and that there's a sense among many that we can't snap out of this without some sort of paradigm shift. But a major feature of the politics here for the last couple of decades has been a lack of responsibility taking, and that unfortunately has borne political dividends because of the way we're financed, because of the operation of the block grant, poor management of public services and poor economic decisions don't impact you in the budget the way they would in a normal political theatre. And I suppose because of the kind of locked in top dog mentality, they don't necessarily impact at the ballot box either. And I think many politicians are quite happy or at least resigned, and sometimes the electorate too, through sheer hopelessness, to endorsing that way of either putting difficult decisions into a bit of a governance black hole in the executive or handing them over to London. So we're kind of locked in this zero-sum game of competing nationalisms, and people are losing faith in the ability of the political structures that were kind of created in such hope in 1998 to deliver. And I know that isn't a feeling unique to Northern Ireland, that kind of sense of pessimism, I suppose, and feeling lost in the political system is what is driving populism and I suppose the politics of culture war around the world. But there is a particularly ingrained sense of it here and the impossibility of change. A core political challenge, therefore, that certainly I and colleagues of the same political tradition face is trying to balance that desire of explaining why change is worth considering, and I mean constitutional change, with the weight of our history and that intention, that desire not to create turbulence in a place that has experienced more of its fair share of it. And in that context, some of the efforts to kind of delegitimize any discussion about a new Northern Ireland or a new Ireland is as, I suppose, counterproductive as those who want to race to a constitutional endpoint. For us, and I think for the SDLP certainly, it isn't about righting an historic wrong or some sort of imagined communities or a fourth grade field, but after 20 years of genuinely trying to make Northern Ireland work, it's getting to some people to look like that might be, and New Ireland might be the only way of living in a functional polity. And I suppose for myself as a social democrat and a self-determinist, somebody who just wants this place to be governed by the people here in all their diversity, you're trying to achieve continuous improvement in the well-being of people's lives. And it is my rational view that a new Ireland in the European Union is the best way to deliver that. And I'm acutely aware of the challenges towards that end goal. But it is important to say that it isn't a sectarian view to hold, nor is the equally rational view, albeit one I don't share, that our future is best in the Union. So while rejecting, and it's trying to balance these things, while rejecting the kind of zero-sum, nothing but the constitutional question way of politics here, it's also important to push back on the notion that having a view and a vision on a new Ireland and wanting to advance it is somehow either backward or subversive. And I think it's an important political point that, in fact, the reason we haven't got to the point of a quick-fire border poll is because of the maturity of politicians like Colm Eastwood and Micheál Martin, who are actually the ones who are acknowledging the fact that a 50% plus one New Ireland isn't really worth having. So as my Assembly colleague Matthew O'Toole has put it, the agreement isn't a post-dated check for Irish unity, but neither is it an amulet to be waved at people who want to set out ideas in good faith. And I think it is entirely possible that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, that we can start to meaningfully getting on with creating change in people's everyday lives, which hasn't been a feature of Northern politics, but we can also start in good faith discussing a future as well. So I think that has been the frustration, that there's been a lot, all the discussion is on the who does governance rather than what we want to achieve and how we do that. And I think the kind of current moment in politics is a really good example of that. And it's meaning that the big, massive political policy challenges that are in front of us, and that's Brexit and everything that has flown from it, COVID and the recovery and the climate crisis, all of these are kind of being done to us, or we're just picking up on what is kind of happening in the UK generally, rather than meaningfully trying to use the particular levers here. And a lot of people have looked at the climate breakdown as a kind of an inflection point and talked about maybe how they can repackage economies that have been quite sluggish, or people have looked at some of the way that COVID has made us rethink economic structures or the way we're living. And as I say, Brexit could even have been used as a way to kind of recalibrate how we work economically, but we have squandered each of those opportunities, and in some cases literally walked off the pitch of talking about that. And I suppose if you look, and again, I don't mean to be hypercritical, but if you look at each of the executive departments, with a few honourable exceptions, none of them are actually doing anything other than ticking over, cutting and pasting last year's policy or last year's budget. And I suppose we're all impressed just by government existing. So I suppose for those of us who do want ultimately to create constitutional change, we have to show that that you can use the structures and that you have to use the structures to deliver some of it in progress. There aren't 20,000 public servants sitting on in a room in Dublin ready to come in and run Northern Ireland in the event of constitutional change. I think the SNP, for the many flaws that they do have done this very well. They have managed to attract people over who wouldn't instinctively have supported constitutional change through their ability to deliver good governance, and they have done it all without firing a shot. As I say, the focus on what we want to do with that constitutional change can't really be answered until we show what we can do with what we currently have. And it's important, particularly for nationalists and those of us who are seeking a different arrangement, that we're clear that we haven't checked out of that strand-run relationship, that we're not trying to walk away from Stormont, that we don't think of it as just a kind of a fast track to what we want to achieve. We consider it as a way to actually build trust and change and change things in the here and now. I suppose then about when that constitutional change happens, I think we're very clear that it won't be something that is slipped by in a period of chaos, and that means that it can't be imminent. We just have to acknowledge the reality that for major change, you need to have the consensus of both the traditional communities. The agreement had it, and Brexit did not have it, and at the moment Irish Unity does not have it. And as I was scribbling that down in a note, I realized that somebody could easily reply that the protocol doesn't have it, but it is important to say that the protocol isn't about creating major change. It is about protecting the patterns and the ways of life and doing business that we currently have. I want to briefly focus on the North there about the North-South relationships, and I suppose in the context of creating that change. And I think it's a fact acknowledged by the Shared Island Unit and by the SDLP's New Ireland Commission that we think kind of complements it, that this discussion is as nascent in the South as the North. The historian Dermot Ferreter has called it a rhetorical empathy that people have for closer relationships with the North. But I think while we do project ourselves around dysfunction and kind of nationalist struggle and I suppose unionist reluctance, I think it will just remain rhetorical. And I think we need to be very, very clear that there's a lot of work to be done to point out the opportunities and also the similarities. And that doesn't mean staying quiet, and it doesn't mean begging for help, but it does mean that pointing out how this won't be a burden, and while opportunities exist, is going to be a necessity. So just finishing up, I wish it was other, but I think Northern Irish political dialogue is I suppose Jana's space. We talk a lot about the past as a way to kind of justify our current political positions, and we talk a lot about a very distant future as a way to kind of deflect from the lack of progress in the here and now. But that is where regardless of your long-term aim, that is where the political focus has to be for now, and an acknowledgement of the reality that there isn't a constitutional arrangement for Northern Ireland or for this island or for the continent that makes all your problems go away or makes your neighbours go away. But looking forward to a conversation about that, and I'm sure plenty of other things as well. Thanks.
Perfect timing. Nicholas.
Brilliant, Claire. Thank you very much. And much to think about and many questions, and I can see people are asking questions already. So thank you for that, and thank you all for being with us. And just before I ask my first question, I want to thank Eugenio and Barry, and also my good friend John Kerrigan. And earlier in my career, Ray Ryan at Cambridge has been a place of great help to thinking about Ireland, Irish literature, Irish culture over the decades, and I'm glad to be a small part of that continuing conversation tonight. Claire, it strikes me in your thinking about this panorama of the decade to come, of the 2 decades to come, of this process of re-engagement, reimagination that is already began with the Good Friday Agreement, began even before that. I know you've had long-standing interest in a writer like Michael Longley. You mentioned James Joyce, and thinking about ways in which the imagination can help to plan different ways of understanding and seeing each other. And Beyond the constitutional question, which we'll come back to, and beyond the protocol, which we'll come back to, would you speak to me a little bit about the kind of work that you've done for people involved in education, in access to healthcare, and improvement of issues of poverty? Because one of the things that it seems to me is avoided in many of the conversations about whether one is British or Irish or not, or neither of those things, what religion one has, what cultural affiliation, just a real question of poverty and a lack of opportunity, which I think would be one of the most damning statistics about the history of Northern Ireland as a state. But perhaps could you tell me a little bit about your work in this?
Yeah, I think that's a really good and clear point you make, Nicholas. We are, as somebody put it, we're at the bottom of all the tables you don't want to be at the bottom of, and at the top of all the deprivation indexes. And I'm not going to claim that I have overturned that. I represent a relatively prosperous constituency, but it was that way whenever I found it. But there are absolutely pockets of need, and I suppose that is the point that I'm making. We haven't the same neighbourhoods and sections of society that we're facing disadvantage and that we're economically marginalised in the main are 20 years after we are supposed to have had the tools. And I think it's worth saying that things like the transfer test, for example, the 11 plus still predominates here, and there's still you're 5 times less likely to get a grammar school place if you are on free school meals than if you aren't, and that hasn't changed through devolution and having the powers to. There is always a sort of a pushback. Oh well, look, these are London's policies, but they're not. There are many opportunities to make change, and I suppose to find efficiencies. For myself, again, you kind of use the levers that you have. When I was in the city council, I was able to make it be a living wage employer at the time, the biggest in Belfast and in Northern Ireland, and tried to make got some modifications made to, for example, the contracts prohibiting the imposition of 0-hour contracts, and I suppose now as an MP you're the journey between having an idea and actually implementing change, I'm afraid, is a little bit longer with the numbers that they are, but it is about advocating how we can use our budget differently, and I suppose how we can refocus our economy and support and go after jobs that are meaningful for people here and that are available and that offer a decent balance. That's what the Assembly's activity should be out. We never seem to have a crisis negotiation about things like the living wage, or about things like workforce planning, or about things like the waiting lists in the NHS. We have them about things like the protocol and about Irish language and about other things that are important, but that don't put bread on the table. As I say, we can do, and we have some success of doing them here in South Belfast, where you can see the voting patterns are changing. I think people are getting a bit frustrated of being just used as kind of sectarian voting fodder, and are finding and are seeing new political opportunities in that.
And that question of climate seems very pressing. I mean, I often think of Belfast as a city basically built on stilts in the old muddy estuary. In Belfast Lough, of a place that actually, there's so many ways in which the geography and the history, complex and global, of the north of Ireland is related to so many other places in the world, and opens up to so many kind of really positive and interesting and enlightening comparative conversations in the way that you were talking about. And I regret slightly in the conversations about Northern Ireland that doesn't often come into play, that it's always this singular place alone by itself. And that's certainly not true even of someone like you and your family background. I mean, I know you were born in the west of Ireland, your family still have strong connections there. Maybe would you share a little bit, and then I want to come back to you being a councillor and an MLA and MP and talk about the protocol.
Sure.
Could you share a little bit about island lives people have in the north of Ireland? I think it'd be helpful.
That's really well observed. You're right. I think, and sometimes I risk even doing that. Think of Northern Ireland as kind of a problem child, rather than the very textured and very appealing place it is now. And I think we're finally kind of coming out of I suppose I was going to say monoculture, but we don't have one culture, we have two cultures in Northern Ireland, but that the kind of richness of the culture and the humor is coming out a wee bit more in some of the art that's being produced. And I suppose a sense that culture doesn't have to mean, you know, Irish dancing and marching bands, you know, that there's a lot in between there. But yeah, I was born in Galway. Both of my parents of the north of County Down and of Belfast, and we moved to Belfast whenever I was a small child. I think it was supposed to be temporary, but it ended up being longer. And I think, and I'm married to a Dub as well, and I think that kind of you know, that kind of movement about is part of what drives understanding of one another. And I suppose, you know, partition was, and you know, it was a pretty artificial and old-fashioned way to solve problems, whether it was here, whether it was in India, whether it was, you know, all sorts of places, just creating a line on a map and saying this is one type and that is one type, you know, is never going to work. But I think some of those kind of connections are finding their feet now. It's also worth saying that, and again, it's kind of been pushed back a wee bit by some of the polarization of Brexit. There was a kind of a growing Northern Irish identity in the last 20 years in Northern Ireland that I found really positive. I suppose acknowledgement that, you know, that new Northern Ireland of 1998 is genuinely a new place and a new country. And I suppose we're talking about centenary this year, but it's a very different place. It was created 23 years ago. And I think, you know, obviously there was hostility to the concept of Northern Irishness from the fringes, but I think it's very positive. And people who say it's kind of partitionist, I go, have you ever met anybody from Cork? You know, they've got a very, very developed sense of an identity that's related to the place that you live in, and it can be a subset of your Irishness, or it can be a subset of your Britishness. And I think it's something that should be nurtured, you know. And you can kind of see it that Derry Girls, for example, you know, it's Irish TV, but it's very much Northern Irish TV, and there's a lot of you know, artists who identify as British, but they are uniquely Northern Irish. And I think that's something that we can, as we build a bit of confidence, you know, see that growing.
You know, being married to someone from Cork, I do my best never to encourage them, but since they've been mentioned, I have to give them their due. Now, it strikes me, just to go back, you know, and just thinking of, we think about that period of association when the UK was a member of the EU, and Northern Ireland, even generationally after 1994, after 1998, that there was really a period. Do you agree with this proposition that there was a period after the Good Friday Agreement and before Brexit when the Union actually had its greatest security? Because you could be all of those things that you've just described, all of the things that I've gestured to before. And that in a sense, well, Northern Ireland was not even saying a period of stasis. It was in a period where some of the layers could settle, that they could find new relations with each other, and this Northern Irish identity that you described starts to come out. And in a way, Brexit has been most destructive of that. And so would you agree with the idea that perhaps what had been was actually security, that meant from a unionist perspective an all island nationalism would never take root? And that in a way, if you really wanted to push it, could you also say that the protocol is, in a curious way, the very, very last protection of the union under these terms?
Well, there's a lot in that basically the European Union was about the fact that you don't have to compromise in your identity. You can be, you know, French and German and still work together. And I think that's why it was proud. That's why Hume saw the value of, for Northern Ireland, you can be British or Irish, and it didn't really matter whether you look to London or Dublin, or whether you know, which way you're facing, because that opportunity to be I mean, many of us, I spent many an evening and afternoon pre-2016 trying to make that point, that kind of you won't know what we've got till it's gone, in terms of that ability to not have to choose, and that Brexit would inevitably, if pursued, you know, in any way other than very soft, would create winners and losers, and I genuinely regret that fell on deaf ears. There is obviously a narrative, and there's some within nationalism who see it as rocket fuel for Irish unity, and therefore a price worth paying. And I couldn't disagree more. I think it's a really scorched earth way to achieve it. I think you're right too about the protocol. And again, you know, the protocol wasn't anybody's first choice. It's certainly the SDLP were quite firm, were very much opposed to the concept when it was announced, but we became, it was the last possible option on the table, and we were courageous enough to make clear in January that in some ways it does provide golden handcuffs into the union, at least for the here and now. It offers economic opportunities that are only available by virtue of being in both Northern Ireland and the European Union. And I suppose, you can look at what we had pre-2016 and say that was in many ways the Agreed Ireland, because it was a constitutional framework that the people North and South endorsed in 1998. It allowed for evolution in different ways, but we also have to acknowledge that the tools, the point I was trying to make earlier, the tools to improve people's lives are already in our hands. We don't have to say, I'm not going to do that until I secure the union, or I'm not going to do that until I achieve Irish unity. We are in the Agreed Ireland by having those. I suppose it means not having to choose. That's what the diffusion of the European Union meant. And I suppose the Good Friday Agreement kind of makes us both Irish and British, and the protocol has an opportunity to make us both European and not European. And as I say, it is people clinging to, I think, a very, very outmoded concept of sovereignty and displaying of sovereignty and flexing of sovereignty that are the problem, both to having a kind of a Northern Ireland that people can feel comfortable in. And as I say, it isn't just Brexit. I suppose people feeling that they can't have the life they want, they can't have the identity they want, they can't, for example, have things even like minority rights and gay marriage and so on, that people didn't feel they could have under the type of politics we were being sold, are what is driving people. So while there are pull factors towards Irish unity of things like a much more dynamic economy, there are push factors and people feeling that they can't actually have rational political discourse in the current configuration. And I think both of those drivers have to be laid at the feet of the same people of the DUP, who are again failing to see that in fact the protocol, and not forcing a very, very sharp line and another confrontation over the protocol actually takes them to a much worse place.
It does seem like one of the great ironies of late history that the people who were for union have now become separatist nationalists through the mechanism of Brexit, and those who were nationalists have now become unionists through the European Union. So
I think that's the kind of driving forces. People talk about Irish nationalism and Scottish nationalism. They are English nationalism are kind of driving the most, I suppose, dangerous, or certainly the most turbulent political dynamics of these islands at the moment.
Well, can I ask you, and we're going to go to Barry, I think, for questions in just a couple of minutes, but I've got one last, and I think important question to ask you, and it relates to your idea earlier that structures are already in place and you have to work within structures. And thinking also about the ways in which those structures haven't worked for many people, and also the way that within a majoritarian structure within the UK, that people in Scotland or Northern Ireland who did not vote for Brexit now have to suffer their consequences. And you've worked on the Belfast City Council as an MLA in the Northern Ireland Assembly, in the devolved Assembly, and you're an MP in Westminster. And in one sense, you're at the very heart of power. But at another, do you ever look around you and think, my one voice or few voices in this large assembly of people from England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, is this really the place where I can represent, the reality and the complexity of life in the place that I come from?
Well, I suppose there's a number of ways of looking at it. You can start from the kind of ethos that you get right from community level, nothing about us without us. Where decisions are being made and conversations being had about our lives and our futures, somebody needs to be there. And it is also a matter of fact, albeit one that we don't discuss, that Northern Irish MPs, had they so chosen, could have dramatically changed the course of Brexit in those wilderness years of 2017 to 2019, when there were a clutch of DUP MPs, but that was about it for Northern Ireland. And either they, or indeed absentious in Sinn Féin, had they chosen to, in both cases, put the interests of the people of Northern Ireland ahead of their own kind of shibboleths, could have given us a soft landing, and there at least 3 votes for that. That could have been the case. But I believe in discussion and building relationships. I don't believe that basically unless you get to be the casting vote, I don't think that's what democracy is. I think it's about presenting a different viewpoint. And even if you ignore the kind of crunch votes, really untruths were allowed to be spoken about Northern Ireland during those years, and it was people were able to downplay I suppose the necessity of protections from Brexit, and some of those narratives were allowed to persist in a way that I don't think they would have done if some of the most egregious things had been contradicted. And I suppose it is also fair when you look at all of those things like the kind of indicative votes. There were a lot of people desperately seeking a solution and a compromise. There were a lot of people who were seeking a case to be made, and I suppose things like a softer form of Brexit wasn't being sold as a way to wasn't being sold as a potential solution to the Northern Irish issue as well as anything else. So look, like I say, in a lot of ways, I felt you could tick more things off and achieve more things in the council, never mind in the assembly, as to say that you won't reach. But look, we're going to even if you see this decade or next or the one after that, you see some sort of constitutional change, we are always going to be next door neighbours with the island of Britain. We're also that strand 3, the east-west relationship, is as important as the north-south one, and the relationships within Northern Ireland. And I personally, would never walk away from that. So if you can build those relationships, if you can show that you value that discourse east-west and our role in shaping decisions, I think that will stand us the future. I wouldn't mind only going maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks, though. I'd like some sort of quasi-abstentionist policy that allowed me to reduce my carbon footprint. But no, I think it's important. I think it's really, really important to have that voice of the moderate centre in Westminster. When you look at some of the, never mind the protocol row, if you look at some of the issues coming our way around the legacy of the Troubles and so on, it's vital, in fact, that centre ground of opinion and that Irish nationalist opinion is available to MPs.
Well, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed our conversation. I'll pass over to Barry. I'd love to have a question from someone actually about legacy issues and about the questions of justice for all in this, but I will leave that to the panel to follow up. Barry.
Smashing. Sorry, is that a question that has come in, or are you trying to provoke questions?
Just in thinking of Claire's final comments there.
Thanks very much, Nicholas. Just to say, that was a real pleasure. I always have a hard job of trying to listen and also try and triage all of the questions, but I think I'd have a really nice evening listening to the two of you going back and forth. It's a real pleasure. As always, I've done my best to group questions across headings. So there's a couple of questions coming your way, Claire, across 3 themes. The first is on life in Northern Ireland. The second is predictably on the protocol. And the third is on what I just dubbed elections. And before that, I have one small thing I want to provoke from you, and I'll also invite Professor Eugenie in case you have anything to add, Eugenio. Claire, you spoke at length and with great passion about historical links with the European Union. You cited the Treaty of Rome, and this is something we've spoken about and that I'm really, really interested in myself. Can you just describe what kind of shape and what nature you expect specifically SDLP relations with the European project might be? Is it possible to maintain? I mean, John Hume is one of the great figures of European social democracy, so it's a real injury to the cause that the SDLP are obviously in a different context. Can you just describe what you think the relations might be like with the European project? And then over to you. Actually, just before you respond, Claire, Eugenio, do you want to say anything?
Well, just following from what you were just saying, the European Union can be conceived as a huge, large-scale Good Friday Agreement. When people have been at war with one another for centuries, decided to focus on the common good. And the big difference between the Good Friday Agreement and the European Union is that in Northern Ireland, parties seem to be unable to think of a common good. And even the institutions designed to create such a common good, or at least to facilitate people in thinking of a common good, seem instead to have produced, as Claire was saying, political dividends for the pre-existing parties. So is this not a fundamental problem in the way people think, not just the parties, but people think?
Maybe just 2 minutes on that, Claire, and then we'll jump straight into the.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things there. I mean, it is worth saying that actually that attachment and the belief in the European identity has soared and peaked since 2016, when I suppose people, it was like the air around us. People didn't realize what it would be like if you didn't have the European Union. But you're right. I mean, I'm a true believer in the project of European social democracy, and taking great comfort in a bit of a resurgence in Norway a few weeks ago and Germany last week. Just it is a complex world, and the solutions are complex. And I think social democracy recognizes that, and it recognizes kind of where we are and not just exactly where we want to be. But I think you're right, Eugenie, that it is the template for conflict resolution in terms of that, to say, being able to keep your identity and pool your sovereignty for the benefit of everybody, but for the benefit economically as well. You know, it wasn't just for kind of the airy-fairy part of it. Hume always said that the best peace process is a job, and he saw those economic opportunities. So I think the protocol and continued participation in the single market are important, because the fact that the very basic fact, and I know we kind of move away from this, is that if you had a border on the island of Ireland, a lot of the life flows and the movement flows would have to end if one part of the island was in the single market and one part of them wasn't. So it isn't always, you know, it isn't about even really identity, and it isn't even really, you know, it's about the fact that you physically couldn't. It's about the movement of goods and the management of regulations, and the fact that is easier to do at half dozen ports than 500 kilometers of road. But I think we will continue. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about that. I don't think there's any appetite from within business to remove ourselves from the single market. What we do have to work on, and one of the genuine, you know, people who sold Brexit pretended a democratic deficit and have actually created a democratic deficit. There is an issue with the fact that Northern Ireland is subject to the rules of the market without a say, but there are opportunities to address that, and the SDLP has made some of those submissions about how, for example, the North-South Ministerial Council could be very effectively used to give Northern Ireland a kind of a feed-in to EU regulations. There's way for the executive to make representations to the Joint Committee. So that's a problem that's there to be solved. But I genuinely don't see any scenario where Northern Ireland is out of the single market or out of the orbit, and I suppose the interests of the European Union, who I think have been faithful and steadfast. And I mean that quite genuinely, with one or two hiccups, like the ill-fated near triggering of Article 16 in January. I think the EU has, over decades, and particularly in the last 5 years, shown a really, really impressive level of understanding of Northern Ireland and patience with Northern Ireland, and I don't see that changing.
If I could very, very briefly just jump in, it's also interesting, I think, in context, you were talking about misrepresentations of Northern Ireland, Claire, and just watching this conversation about food wars as part of the argument against the protocol really struck me with the idea, the ridiculous idea, that Northern Ireland would ever run out of sausages, that it was connected to things that have been said about the European community and the EU in the UK in the 70s and 80s. It had the echoes of butter mountains and milk lakes in the background. And so I think finding elements of rhetoric from British or English political culture being transposed onto apparent economic realities in Northern Ireland. And when you, I think following that, and even like following the conversation about Marks and Spencer's at the moment and how Christmas is going to be, there's one way not to think about the reality of life on the ground in Northern Ireland, but the degree to which there's anxiety in the metropolitan UK system of governments about what Northern Ireland is or means in relation to the prospect and project of Brexit in the UK.
I genuinely, I think it's an afterthought. I mean, and I think polling, both of kind of the public in general in the UK and particularly of Conservatives, shows that, you know, there might be a desire to kind of possess Northern Ireland like my toddler possesses a toy, but there isn't that much of an understanding. You're right, people, to make throwaway remarks about kind of, you know, starving them out to make them, you know, agree to the protocol, ignoring the fact that this is probably the most food secure island in the world. But there isn't understanding, and there's kind of an unwillingness to understand. And I do worry that in many cases, the kind of I think it's very clear that the protocol row isn't about us. It isn't about because it's not what businesses are saying, it's not what the public are saying, you know, and the fact that it's being framed around, you know, jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, that's I haven't seen that on a placard, you know. So it isn't really about it. It's about creating a mine for grievance, and I suppose it's about not having an end point in Brexit, because then you know, those who brought it would be responsible for the outcome. So they don't want Brexit to be concluded, and they don't want to give away the bogeyman of the EU. And I suppose that the regret is that just for years there was an understanding that you don't really use Northern Ireland to grandstand. You know, you kind of you have to be a little bit more serious about the outcomes, and I think unfortunately that convention has been torn up. But no, so I don't think it's about us. I don't think the protocol. I genuinely think it's kind of, we are being used as a political by somebody who, and I don't mean to be, you know, personal, but I mean, David Frost is a bird of passage. He has this gig for a few months or a year or two or whatever. I don't think there's any depth of understanding about the complexity, and I don't think there's any shortage of people who have tried to explain it. But the protocol is being used for a political purpose, and I think that's something that the government will ultimately, regret doing, in that they have the hard Brexit they desired, they have a big majority, but there isn't really any vision. And I think that's what's very frustrating for people. They're the dog that caught the car, and they're not actually using it to shape positively. There are ways that you could go on from this point positively. And I suppose here, as somebody who isn't particularly attached to the Union of the UK, you know, you're often pegged as being anti-British or anti-English. Far from it. There's loads of things I love about the UK. I love the NHS. I love a lot of the cultural things, but that's not what's ever being sold to me. What's being sold is just kind of a poke Johnny Foreigner in the eye type politics, and it's a real missed opportunity. It's not me they need to win over. It's millions of voters in GB who are horrified at where this is going, and horrified about the lack of care that's being taken over their neighbour, because obviously hundreds of thousands of people move between Britain and Ireland, and a multiple of that number do understand the complexity, and I suspect are watching on in horror at how this is being handled.
Nicholas, if you're to respond, do it well briefly, please.
And very briefly, but I'm sure you see this amongst your constituents, but actually one of the things that has horrified me most of it all, beyond the question of identity, but just is the bringing up again of traumatic memory for many people who lived that, even if they lived a normal life there. But the degree to which many of us in the diaspora and in Northern Ireland now, of my generation, I'm sure, have so many difficult experiences to think about, which we've overcome, you managed to put in place in your life, and something like Brexit just brings all this up again, and none of our behest. And then told again that we must forget it. And it's a very irresponsible, I think, and deeply unethical part of this moment in our shared relations.
I'm really glad you said that, and I'm very reluctant to interrupt this this conversation. It's not for the first time. I wish we had longer than an hour, but our kind of format is always to try and be in and out inside an hour. So Claire, Nicholas, thanks so much for this really engaging discussion. I'm going to move swiftly to as many of the questions as we can manage to get through. Rest assured, anyone who we don't get to, I'll be sure to send the questions on to Claire. So I'm going to begin with our first of three themes, life in Northern Ireland. And we'll start with a regular at our series, John Cartledge. Good evening again, John. Just a change of gear a little bit. To quote John, you referred, Claire, to locked-in sectarianism. How much is this mentality due to denominational schooling? Given that religious discrimination is an offence in most other walks of life, why is it tolerated and perpetuated as the foundation of the education system? You can treat the second half of that as you wish, but if you want to comment on that, Claire. Right,
yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that in Northern Ireland where education doesn't change, and where people continue to live separate lives, it's hard to see the patterns being broken. It is worth saying that we don't focus so much on the issue of segregated housing, and I'm very much a supporter of integrated education, but it's difficult to have an integrated school in a village or in a neighbourhood where everybody is Catholic or everybody is Protestant. So you've got to do the two things together, and the same kind of mind of public policy has to be applied. I'll be honest, we're in the middle of failing to implement reforms in the health service as well. Bengal was the latest of a number of reports saying that basically you need systemic change, and we are kind of refusing to buy into the concept of maybe repackaging and reallocating health services across 20 hospitals. So people are very, very anxious about the possibility of Northern Ireland, as I say, and our history of not taking hard decisions, at the possibility of reformatting over 1,000 schools. And I think that's the fundamental problem in terms of how we achieve integrated education. There's no doubt that we must, and that it should be prioritised, and that new schools, for example, should by default be integrated. But as I say, you can't have them unless the neighbourhoods that they exist in are integrated. We pushed for, and we got a new decade, new approach, a bit of a Bengoa for education that starts to get us from the concept that people should be educated together to how you actually deliver it, and that doesn't ignore the fact that schools themselves. I believe, and I'm one myself, a parent who moved between sectors from the state sector, which would be known as Protestant schools, because it was my local good school, to the Catholic sector because it's my local good school. And in the main, parents want to be able to walk. They want a breakfast club for £1, and they want, they want those things, and they want excellence in education. And if their local Methodist school or the local Catholic school offers those things, people are entitled to kind of vote with their feet and not have to, do the heavy lifting on ethos. But there's no doubt about it being a core part of how you break down those divisions. But as I say, if people are still going home, leaving, going in and going out the same door, but going home to very separate social lives and cultural lives, we're not actually going to break the patterns in the way we want to.
Phenomenal. Claire, for the second group of 3, I'm just improvising as we go along as I watch the clock. The second group is now called Protocol and Northern Ireland Politics Now, okay? So I'm going to give you 2 questions, and then we'll have space hopefully for up to 3 questions in the last group. We have 10 minutes. Okay, the first is from Stephen Butcher, and I'm going to have to quote it at length. While parts of Britain have been suffering shortages of petrol and food supplies, Northern Ireland has largely escaped the effects of the distribution crisis, even though it's also subject to what are, according to the Unionists, the disastrous consequences of the Northern Ireland Protocol. All this in inverted commas, right? Question: how can those parties that are not opposed to the protocol in principle persuade the general public of its inherent advantages for the local economy, using the relative effects of the fuel shortages as an example? Second question. Sorry, I'll just yoke these together and then maybe go on it. From Gerard MacDonald. Change the tack again. We've experienced just over a decade of a Sinn Féin DUP-led Northern Ireland executive. Do you believe they failed? This is actually, Nicholas did ask you about this, so you can be light touch if you wish. Do you believe they failed to lift the living standard, the standard of living in Northern Ireland? And what indicators could you highlight to demonstrate your response? As I said, you kind of touched on that, so deal with it as you wish. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the protocol one is very, very good point. I mean, they do say the best way to solve a problem is to deny it exists. And I think for the irony of kind of being told that the protocol is creating chaos and turbulence in the streets in Northern Ireland, when people are literally punching the head of each other in petrol forecourts in a way that they aren't here, is not lost on people. And again, that's my point, that it's being used to kind of keep an angry front and I suppose to keep the kind of the Brexit ultras on board. It is trying to sell the possibilities over the noise of the protocol, but unfortunately we know, and we've known for many years, that business requires stability and it requires a level of certainty around the rules, which is why business is saying, please do not trigger Article 16, because it will drive even further away the prospect of some of the investment that we know we're on the cusp of. There's documented evidence of businesses seeking to take advantage of that dual market access, but holding back because they don't know either whether the kind of turned on and turned off violence that we saw at Easter is going to be, the switch is going to be flipped again, or whether those rules are going to be torn up, so they're not going to build around it. It is very difficult to do. It has been, I suppose, the attempt is to try and de-dramatize. There is a danger, and I suppose to force the media not to present it as win-lose and identity based. We haven't really succeeded in that, I'm afraid, unfortunately. But I think if you go around, I'm always struck by the young man who spoke to our committee, the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, about the prospect of violence, and he's become, he's an articulate young loyalist, but he has repeatedly said, no, the protocol doesn't affect my everyday life, but my leaders keep telling me I'm losing. And that's what we need to get back to. It isn't, yes, there are some disruptions, and there's some parcels are taking longer and some things, but there's not a single product that isn't available in Northern Ireland. Our sausages are better than Marks and Spencer sausages for a start, but it is until I suppose those who didn't show any care about the views of people here when they voted at every possible turn for the hardest Brexit, until they only want to peddle fear and anxiety, it's going to be a very difficult thing to do. The second question was about, do I think that the political structures? No, I don't, and I genuinely, that's what I think is tragic about it. We have squandered all of the possibility of devolution of resource and of interest and of that in the years after the Good Friday Agreement. That interest there was in Northern Ireland and that willingness to try and make it work, and we have just ploughed a separate but equal furrow, and that we have actually pulled communities even further apart, and we kind of have ministers for Catholics and ministers for Protestants rather than any sense of common purpose. And as I say, if we didn't find common purpose over things like COVID and things like climate, it's very difficult to see how we're going to. And I believe that there is just a desire to keep things rolling in culture war for the DUP and Sinn Féin, rather than to actually use the tools. I know it's a cliche at this point, but I'm not sure that any of them are particularly invested or needing Northern Ireland to work very well at the moment, because for both it kind of upsets their current political pitch if things are kind of bumping along in a boring way.
Tell you what I'm going to do, if I may. Thank you very much, Claire. There are, I think, a maximum of 3 more short questions I'm going to put to you, and you can pick, right, if you want to comment on any of them. And then I know Nicholas well enough. I'm going to give you a minute at the end, Nicholas, if you wish to respond to anything Claire said. Perhaps you'd like to do that. So the third group of questions on elections and future politics. The first 2 come from Thomas Shanahan. Thomas asks, will the SDLP, I mean, it's a blunt question, Claire, will the SDLP campaign actively for a move towards independence at next year's Assembly elections? And if so, how will it try to build consensus? I mean, just a biggie like that. Secondly, from Thomas, is it possible that the rise of Sinn Féin in the Republic could discourage the move towards independence in Northern Ireland? Which I think is an interesting question. And then there was a bunch of questions that I'm kind of deriving or deciphering from Anne Black and Tracy Dempsey, where they've asked, what would you say to women who are now concerned about a united Ireland, given the fact that self-identification was brought in 2015? So there are 3 questions I'll leave to you and see how much of it you wish to answer. Thanks, Claire.
Sure. I mean, on the issue of independent, I presume you mean Irish unity. No, we won't. And as I say, I made the point before that Colm Eastwood and Micheál Martin could say, let's have it, let's do the border poll, let's all go down, this flight of, and 1, it would be lost, and 2, it would create division. And there's no point in pretending, because people are still anxious about it, and we haven't Hume always said it isn't about uniting the territory, it's about uniting the people. And Brexit, while it has done many things, and while it has certainly enlivened the question in people's mind, it has not united people. So I think we have just seen in very, very lurid detail what happens when you have a referendum and a big massive constitutional question without any idea of how you're going to deliver it. And that has been Brexit, and it has been chaotic in more ways than one. There is also, even if the island of Ireland, north or south, were ready to go further in that conversation. And as I say, I just don't think there's a lot of people who are curious and up for a pragmatic argument, but that case has not been pressed at the moment. And as I say, I just don't believe that the majority of opinion in the south has gone yet beyond that rhetorical empathy that I spoke about, and actually thought through the reality. So to push for that now would be wrong. You have to it's not about the date, it's about the context of a border poll. Like I say, it's not about not talking about it. I think the conversation is happening, and the detailed work needs to be done as well. But it would be populist and irresponsible to kind of pretend that we're ready for it as soon as next year. In terms of Sinn Féin's growth in the South, which I think is kind of in many ways unrelated to Irish Unity. I think a lot of their base obviously are, but I think it kind of people who've done kind of polling and poking around in the numbers show that, you know, it isn't the top of the agenda for many people. That is being driven by in the main economic factors in the South. The fact that Sinn Féin haven't been tried out, and there's a perception that all of the other configurations of coalition and of government have been tried out, and that people want to try something new. I don't believe that's necessarily going to work out, because, as I say, I've lived under a Sinn Féin government for 15 years, and utopia it ain't. But so I think that is one factor. Yes, I think it will. In some ways, I think it could spook middle unionism who aren't impressed with how Sinn Féin govern, and aren't impressed with I suppose the level of outreach and the commitment to genuinely building relationships. And as I say, if there's a perception that we're in government now, we're going to have the question, we're going to do the border poll right now before people are ready, I think that will be counterproductive. Like I say, if it's had and it's lost, I don't think that's healthy for everyday political discourse or the achievement of a new Ireland.
Fantastic. Okay, Nicholas, do you wish to respond?
Just to say thank you to Claire and Eugenio, to you, Barry. I suppose just on reflection of the things that were said, that, I mean, one thing about Brexit is it's shown that partition in its first phase was neither natural or eternal or given, something which is part of a long, immutable, flexible history of British and Irish and European and indeed world politics, and we're part of that now. But I suppose what you've made me think, Claire, today, I think of the work of someone like Councillor Brian Smith in Belfast, the Green Party, of thinking about the actual future of actual people in their lived and daily lives. And were you to ask yourself, had Northern Ireland been a success? How has union been precious? Well, we hear not every day that we get to meet at the dawn of a new British Renaissance, but really, are the questions we should be asking, has Northern Ireland included as many people as it could in education? Has it lifted as many people as it could out of poverty? Has it helped people avoid hatred and live full and happy lives? And the degree to which it hasn't are those things that can be fixed only on insular local terms. How can they be connected to what we know from other experiences in other parts of the world? And how could people, wherever they grew up, in Belfast or in Derry or in Macrofelt or in Coleraine, Portstewart, Portrush, County Down, wherever it is, how can they lead their fullest, happiest, safest lives on the most equitable terms possible? And it seems to me that those are the kinds of questions that we should be asking. So thank you all very much today.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Professor Bugini? Okay, then it's just left to me for 30 seconds of further housekeeping. Thank you so much to Nicholas and Claire. It was an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to continuing the discussions in other forums. I should just say, next Monday, I'm meeting with Julian Smith MP, the former Secretary of State. Unfortunately, has had to be rescheduled. Oh. But we're delighted that we have Hugo McNeil, who is the outgoing chair of the British Irish Association and a major figure in UK-Irish relations, international businessman and former international rugby player, who's going to be joining us. Very excited about that. And then a week hence, on the 18th of October, we'll have Bertie Ahern. The week after that, on the 25th of October, we will have Eileen Weir from the Shankill Women's Centre. So some really great speakers lined up. The details are on the website shared in the chat. So thank you, everybody, for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Barry.